To my fellow Anglo-Quebecers, I say, don't worry, your rights will be fully protected.
Montreal man is furious after allegedly being refused service by two STM workers because he spoke English. What's more, when Michael Dunning tried to file a formal complaint, he says another STM worker told him he had to speak French.
The guys in perfect English said, "We don't serve English people." Then he started cursing, saying all kinds of things in French.
Projet Montréal's Alex Norris is being criticized because he was asked a question at a public event in English and he chose to respond in French.
I think that there was just a bit of an assumption that all Anglophones should just be expected to perfectly understand French. That's not always the case.
If you don't live in Quebec, but are thinking about moving there or visiting, and you're watching this documentary right now, what I just showed you probably scared the daylights out of you, right? Well, it's actually kind of funny if you think about it. There are some who say that you absolutely need to speak French living in a city like Montreal, or you won't survive. And then there are others who say that you can get by fairly easily in this city without knowing French too well. In a way, those people are kind of right. You can. It isn't really that hard. Yeah, it feels weird at times trying to avoid having to use a language that you have a sketchy grasp on, especially when you want to fully immerse yourself into this culture. But it's English enough here so that it's not a problem. It's really not a big deal. Hi, I'm David McIntyre. I'm 21 years old, and I'm a journalism student at Concordia University in Montreal. But I'm originally from Calgary, Alberta. And for someone who's voluntarily moved from one side of the country to another, things are going pretty well for me here so far. But my journey in Montreal hasn't been without its challenges, particularly with language. And the election of Pauline Marois as Premier of Quebec has shown me how contentious of an issue language really is in this province. I was never taught French past the age of 9. And as they say about languages, if you don't use it, you lose it. Not that I really learned much to begin with, mind you. I only really remember learning certain expressions like bonjour and merci and comment ça va in those French classes, and I also remember us singing a song about pizza, but that's about it. I was living in Toronto at the time that I actually was learning French, and when I moved to Calgary when I was 10 years old, none of the schools I went to even taught French. In fact, my elementary school in Calgary taught Spanish as a second language rather than French. Not to mention my parents have never really been fluent in French at all. But despite my linguistic disadvantages, I decided to take it upon myself anyway to make my way 3,000 kilometers eastward and live and study in Montreal. So this is the apartment I live in now, in NDG. And this is the house where my parents live in Calgary. And yes, that's my mom shoveling our walkway. So I've also had to go from living at my parents' house on one side of the country to living on my own in another. But beyond just the language, there are some things about Calgary's culture that seem to be absent from Montreal's. In Calgary, you can't buy beer at convenience stores, pickup trucks are easier to find on the road, and people go crazy over events like the Calgary Stampede, even if they don't necessarily show it. So while I'm studying here at Concordia, I've been taking French classes once almost every semester, and trying my best to adapt to the city's ever so prominent bilingual culture. Like for example, when I try to talk French with people, this is what happens, in the best of times.
Alors, qu'est-ce que tu aimes faire dans tes temps libres à Montréal?
Dans mes temps libres, j'aime faire la promenade au centre-ville ou au Vieux-Port. J'aime aller au cinéma avec mes amis et j'aime aller au bar ou au bowling. Oui, c'est qu'est-ce que j'aime.
Not bad for a 21-year-old Scottish kid from Calgary, right? Well, let's just say putting that sentence together took some practice.
Qu'est-ce que tu aimes faire à Montréal?
Je fais une promenade sur le Vieux-Port et le centre-ville et j'aime faire le
Super bien. Alors, qu'est-ce que tu aimes faire dans tes temps libres à Montréal?
Dans mes temps libres à Montréal, j'aime faire le promenade au Vieux-Port ou au centre-ville et j'aime d'aller au bar avec mes amis et j'aime aller au cinéma et je
Coming here from out of province is a, shall we say, interesting experience, but I regret nothing about moving here. In fact, I've been lucky enough to meet a lot of amazing people during my time spent here, some of whom are bilingual or francophone themselves. And when I talk to them, they say it's not as hard as some people think for someone living in Montreal to get along in this city without really speaking French, once you get used to the Montreal way of life, at least.
I mean, I have lived here for a really, really long time, so I do see both of those sides. I mean, if you're talking about just getting around, I'd say Montreal is fairly easy to get around if you only speak English. Now, that is dependent on the neighborhood. I'd say most of Montreal, that's the case. But if you go to the East End, or if you go to Montréal Nord, you know, there are neighborhoods where it's going to be a little trickier. Or you're going to get a reception that's not as warm. But I'd say that's not the general case for Montreal.
I used to work in tourism, and like people, like Americans especially, like they cross the border and they're like, am I going to be able to get, like, you know, like speak English in Montreal? Are people going to be able to understand me? Like they have this expectation because of like how Quebec is portrayed outside Quebec, that we all speak only French and like we're not like flexible, and like it's not reality for most people, like that they only speak like one language and don't understand anything about the other language. So I think you can survive in Montreal speaking only French, and you can survive in Montreal speaking only English, and you can even like survive like speaking another language as long as you're staying in like your neighborhood and if people are speaking that language as well. So
I think you can survive. The thing is, your quality of life will not be as good if you don't speak French, but for sure you can survive and you might even get a job, but it's gonna take much more effort for you to find a job and stuff like that, because a lot of employers are looking for either French people or bilingual people. So you might get a job somewhere where you don't deal with the public, but in the end, like, you're better off if you speak both languages.
As for people like me who came here from out of province not speaking much French, the ones I've met have each seen firsthand how hard it can be sometimes to get along without much prior knowledge of the language.
When I first moved here for the first year, I was very shy and quiet because I was too scared to talk to anyone. I thought I would either mutilate their language or insult them by speaking English, so I was very quiet. But I've grown to learn that, I don't know, there's like I think English is just as strong a presence here as French is, so I've learned that and I've learned to deal with it. So
yeah, if you speak very limited French, it can be difficult at times depending on what you're doing. Things like paying bills or getting help with your, I don't know, your electricity bill or something can be difficult because it's mainly done in French. But I think that all of me and my friends are sort of an example that you have to improve. Like either you adapt or you get left behind, right? And I think that's what people have been doing for the last few years, and that's why I think about 90% of Anglophones now are bilingual. So it seems like everyone is going on that route towards bilingualism.
There's definitely a certain amount of culture shock that comes with living here, since I didn't really grow up around the bilingual culture that is Montreal. Especially when I go home and I'm suddenly not seeing French-only ads or billboards when walking down the street. But even despite the challenges I've already faced here, I wouldn't trade many of my experiences living here for the world. You might be wondering, David, why are you still so passionate about living in Montreal if there's such a big language issue? I say, because as far as quality of life is concerned, Montreal is my favorite place to live by a country mile. There's so much to see and do in this city that it makes my decision to move out of my parents' basement 4 provinces west of here that much more worth it. Where I'll end up after my time at school is over, I'm not sure. I'll cross that bridge when I get to it. But this much I know. I'm perfectly happy with spending as much of it as possible staying right here.